All right, hopefully with all this talk of technology, I can make this little green button work, but we'll give it a try. Good morning. Delighted to be here and delighted to talk about this topic we have of building the future today. You know, when I thought about this, what I realized is I didn't really understand a lot about the future. I did a lot of research. I read the 2030 Transportation and Infrastructure, which, by the way, is absolutely outstanding. But it really gives you a glimpse into what the future of our infrastructure, at least in the built environment, ought to look like. And what we're going to do is take a lot of that vision and try to turn it into some practical things that you should think about when you're thinking about the next lease you sign, the next building you build, the next environment, the physical environment that you occupy. We won't talk about home applications, but I would tell you that's evolving rapidly as well. So, first, what are our challenges in 2030? When I started thinking about this, I realized something simple. That's only 11 years away. Talking about something that all of us will experience in the very, very near future. This is not a distant concept. This is upon us, and actually, as you've heard from many folks, is frankly arriving sooner than we could possibly believe. There's three things that we'll talk about when we think about this idea of the future. First is connectivity. How will connectivity affect our buildings? Well, you know, this concept of the Internet of Things, what is that? What does that really mean? It really means something, whatever kind of device is connected to the internet. That is the Internet of Things. And now we're talking about a future that looks like this. Right now we have computers connected to the internet. That's actually only 1.7 billion devices. That's expected to go down in the next 11 years. Believe, you know, in my lifetime, to think that the number of computers that will be used in the world will actually decrease is going down. Communications, 14.6 billion devices right now. That's an annual compounded growth rate there of 7.8, so that's growing. What's growing even faster? Consumer devices. 13.8%. Medical devices, 20%. Automotive and transportation, we just heard a lot about what the transportation, your transportation to another part of Florida will look like. That's actually growing very rapidly at 21.4%, but what's growing most rapidly of all forms of internet connectivity is commercial and industrial electronics, which will directly affect. So, how many Internet of Things devices are there today? 27 billion. In 2030, 125 billion, a five-fold increase in how many things are connected to the internet in just 11 years. So, to put it in perspective, from when the internet really began, you know, way back in 1960, we just had mainframes, about 1 million of them. As we sit here, computers, 100 million. Right now, we're in this mobile internet stage, billions of units. In 2030, we'll be talking about tens of billions, again, 125 billion things connected to the internet. We've got to think about the space we occupy and make sure we're prepared for that. So, what kind of commercial and industrial applications are we talking about? So I'm going to focus on that because that specifically affects the built environment. First, on the far left, is this concept of equipment and fleet maintenance. When you think about all these autonomous vehicles, how do we manage them? How do we maintain them? You start to think about our embedded chips that tell you when an automobile or a piece of equipment is about to break. You're not waiting for it to break. You're preparing. You're getting a notification that it's going to fail in the relatively near future. Plug loads. A huge amount of our electricity is used just by what you're plugging in. How do we meter that? How do we measure that? Our HVAC systems. Personal, this one's interesting. Personal sensors. In 2030, when you walk in the room will know you are there. The room will know what you expect. The room will respond to basically what is programmed for you specifically. That's what that built environment is going to start to look like. Lighting loads, as well as security and safety, are going to be huge components of the Internet of Things, and all that has to be incorporated into the buildings we currently occupy. So how do we make sure that our buildings are really prepared to meet that Internet of Things future that we're talking about? It's pretty straightforward, really. First and foremost, strong cellular service. 5G cellular service is upon us. We've got to make sure that our buildings actually have that connectivity. It's forecasted that by 2030, 70% of all internet connections will actually be through cellular service as opposed to Wi-Fi. A lot of reasons for that, but we could talk about that more. But you also need Wi-Fi for those local connections, those near connections in your building. And on Wi-Fi, right now we're in the 802 standard. The question is, will we be ready for a 5.9 gigahertz standard? But I think the most important aspect of all this is, instead of us getting connections through towers, especially as it relates to cellular, we need to think about having a connection in our buildings, in our physical spaces. I know in the building I occupy right now, I'm ashamed to say it, there's certain areas where you just don't have connectivity. That won't work in just a couple of years. The next thing we'll talk about after connectivity is flexibility. And when we think about flexibility, what's the office space of the future really look like? The fact is, by 2030, I'll probably be done at least doing the kind of work I'm doing right now. Millennials will make up 75% of the workforce. They were born using computers, they were born connected to the internet. They want to work differently than we do. By then, 50% of our population will likely work remotely. Doesn't mean they'll work at home in their pajamas. What it means is they will work in different places on a constant basis. Do you need seats for everyone when everyone or half your population is working somewhere else on a regular basis? In my office right now, we have a general rule: unless you sit there more than 3 days a week, you don't get a seat assigned to you, right? And why is that? Why would we occupy so much space for folks who are there 10, 15, 20% of the time? We want to make that more of a hoteling space. But I would tell you by 2030, just about everything is going to be hoteling space. And then finally, how do we plan for this change in work? We're going to have less desks than we have right now for dedicated to individuals. We're going to have more people working remotely. I've got a meeting that I've got to be at virtually at 1 o'clock. I'm going to be up in the WeWork space at 1 o'clock handling that meeting, and then I'll come back and rejoin you guys. But again, working remotely, what does that look like? If it weren't for this great facility that has that kind of space where I could connect to the internet, have that video connection, I wouldn't be able to work effectively. Today I can, because Sid and Kits and Partners have frankly created that kind of space that we're talking about. I think you'll see a lot less individual desks. We're going to have a lot more spaces where people can gather together. When folks do come to your office, they're going to be there to meet with other folks. So you've got to have small group rooms, small meeting rooms of the future that frankly can be booked on your mobile app, where folks, 3 or 4 folks, can gather together and have a discussion face to face. Because one thing that I think is especially true in the future, communication is always most effective face to face, always. And we can't lose that. So we've got to create space for that in our built environments. Finally, again, we're going to work from everywhere. We're going to work from home. We're going to work in the office. We're going to work at the local Starbucks. We're going to work in our hotels. We have to have systems in our offices that are designed for folks working anywhere and everywhere, and we're not there yet. In that future, that demand is coming very, very quickly. Finally, parking. You know, we just heard a beautiful vision of how we'll get from point A to point B in Florida. But that means dramatic changes to how we park, okay? What does that look like? What about parking decks that are convertible to office space? Parking decks, you know, we're building some huge parking facilities right now. We're not going to need as many in just a decade. Do we build something today that we're taking down, or do we build it and plan it for that future that is not so far away? You know, if we're building a parking facility, a vertical parking facility right now, and we're not preparing it for a future where at least half of the cars are going to be charged electrically rather than driven to a gas station, we're missing an opportunity. It doesn't mean you have to put in all that electrical distribution right now, but you at least need to prepare the deck to be transformed into that. And that's simply just making conduits, making openings in the work, in the physical environment to get power to where it needs to be. You don't have to run it yet, you just have to prepare for it. Parking in 2030, this was one study, I forgot the name, I'll get it for you if you like it. But in this particular study, it showed that by 2030, personal owned vehicles are what you see in the black line or the black bars. It will go from about 100% of where we were in 17 and 18 down to just maybe 5–10% of all miles traveled. That's one study group's scenario of what our 2030 future look like. Do I think it's that extreme? No, but I would tell you it's going to look very different than it looks today. And we need to prepare our built environments to accommodate that. This final thing I want to talk about, connectivity, flexibility, the final thing is resilience. We need to make sure our buildings are resilient. You saw this chart a minute ago. Natural disasters are growing. We've got to prepare for that. What does that look like in our buildings? Multiple energy sources. If we just have one source of energy that's not renewable, that's not reliable, we need to think through how we make sure we have some redundancy in our power. Multiple water sources. I'm a civil engineer. Believe me, you can do without power longer than you can do without water. Trust me on that. Weather fortified, especially where we live here in Florida, you've got to think about making your buildings hurricane resistant. And then finally, we're 30 feet above sea level right now. Sid was wise enough to think about a community that had that. All of us should be thinking about that in our built environment. So with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.